Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give a few seconds for people to join the chat or to join the room. I can see 35 of you already here. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. And again, greetings, dear friends. On behalf of the Quaker United Nations Office, the American Bar Association, Center for Human Rights, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, The Real Costs of the Push to Rearm in Europe and Beyond, Implications for Arms Control, Business and Human Rights, and International Law. My name is Yvette Isar, and I'm a consultant with the Quaker United Nations Office in Geneva. I'm joined by two of my QUNO colleagues, Daniela Campos and Naya Al-Sheikh Hassan, as well as Daphne Gerazio from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, providing technical support. Thank you to them. We were meant to be joined by Dr. Cindy Ebbs, who's unfortunately been prevented from being with us at the last minute, and she sends her apologies. While I'm sad that Cindy can't be with us, I'm very, very pleased to share moderation with Dr. Lana Baidas, Program Director at the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights. Thank you very much, Lana, for jumping aboard last minute. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. This event is being recorded. A video and transcript will be made available afterwards. You're very warmly invited to use the question and answer box anytime during the discussion. We will be gathering your questions and bringing them into the conversation. The chat box is also available, but it can be distracting, so please only use it to report technical issues if you really need them, like if you can't hear, or you can also use it for short comments or to share relevant links and resources. With that, I think we can turn to our conversation today. So, friends, we are convening at a moment of profound change and instability, marked by heightened geopolitical tensions between major military powers, and the outbreak of large-scale violent conflicts are devastating the lives of millions of living beings around the world. In this already worrying context sits another alarming trend. Global military expenditure has now risen for 10 consecutive years, reaching an unprecedented $2.7 trillion in 2024. Now let's put that in perspective. That amount is roughly equivalent to the entire GDP of the African continent. It would fund the regular budget of the UN 750 times. And unfortunately, this rising trajectory shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon. In fact, it's projected to lead to global military spending that'll reach anywhere between 4.7 or at the higher end, $6.6 trillion by 2035. Now, these are just some of the figures available in the UN Secretary General's 2025 report on military expenditure, a report that was released just last month. It's titled The Security We Need, and it doesn't make for particularly light reading. It does offer a sobering analysis of current and projected military spending, and it describes the direct and indirect costs associated with these outlays. It warns that increasing military spending does not yield greater peace, but instead undermines our shared vision for a sustainable future. Such spending appears to stand in contradiction to Article 26 of the UN Charter, which envisages the establishment and maintenance of international peace and security with the least diversion of the world's human and economic resources for armaments. So with these record high levels of military spending, levels that are expected to climb even higher, we have to ask, is the current security paradigm really working for us? Do these massive outlays in military spending actually make the world any safer? And what are rearmaments trade-offs? How do we identify and spotlight the social, economic, and human rights and democratic costs of this spending? And crucially, do citizens actually support these outlays? Or would they prefer that available resources were directed to other global priorities? Development, health, human rights, gender equality, and we could go on. So I'm very grateful today to have with us a panel of experts from different fields, disarmament, economics, human rights, law, climate change, to help us grapple with the question, what does our current security paradigm actually cost in financial, social, and human terms? I will now turn to my co-moderator, Lana Vaidas, to help introduce our wonderful panelists. Lana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yvette, for your kind introduction. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening from wherever you are connected on this chat and conversation and timely conversation. It's my honor and pleasure to be here with you today and introduce our panel of distinguished speakers in order of speaking. Let me start with Dr. Nan Tian, who is a senior researcher and program director of the CIPRI Military Expenditure and Arm Production Program. Since October 2016, he has been responsible for monitoring and managing the CIPRI Military Expenditure database. His research work at CIPRI includes issues related to the trends of global military expenditure, the demand and consequences of military spending, and the transparency and budgeting on military-related matters. Nan's work also involves assessing and analyzing trends in the global arms industry. His other research interests include the causes and impact of civil conflict and the interlinks between conflict and military spending. His doctoral thesis is titled Military Spending, Conflict and Developments, and explore the relationship between military spending, civil conflict, and economic development. Our next speaker, Dr. Leon Kostianos Jankovic, senior researcher and principal investigator in the project Rearming Europe and with Legal Accountability, RELI, at Asser Institute. Leon is an international law scholar who specializes in arms trade and human rights. He's a senior researcher at the Asser Institute for International and European Law in The Hague, where he regularly advises governments on arms export policy and has extensive experience with projects involving interdisciplinary research, multi-stakeholder engagement, and advocacy. His work focuses on identifying legal safeguards and risk mitigation strategy that can prevent wrongful weapons transfer from threatening human lives and the environment. He teaches international law at the University of Amsterdam, where he also supervises the International Law Clinic on Access to Justice for Gun Violence. Our next speaker, Professor Cecilia Bayet, UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity. Professor Bayet is also a professor at the Faculty of Law of University of Oslo, Norway. She's also director of the master program in international law, where she created the master's level courses on the international law of peace. She supported the creation of an international solidarity map to highlight the positive role of civil society in promoting human rights, peace, and environment protection, solidarity actions around the world. Professor Bayet has published extensively on transnational and cross-disciplinary issues within international law, including general public international law, human rights, refugee law, constitutional law, counterterrorism, gender and women's rights, solidarity, and peace. She has contributed to lectures to the UN Audiovisual Library of International Law. Professor Bayet authored and edited books include Research Handbook on International Solidarity and the Law, the construction of the customary law of peace, Latin America, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Also, and finally, the research, and the last one, the research handbook on international law and peace. The next speaker will be Ms. Ruth Rodd, who is a researcher and project coordinator at Shadow Word Investigation UK. In her role, she's working primarily on investigating, analyzing, and campaigning against militarism and a harmful international arms trade. Road focuses in recent years has been on British and German arms exports, particularly their impact in Yemen and Palestine. She's also the program manager of the Arms Trade Corruption Tracker, a project she co-founded in 2020 that maintains an online database of cases of corruption in the arms trade. She holds an MA in International History and Politics from the Geneva Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Her MA thesis dealt with unarmed civilian intervention in conflict. Over several years, she supported a variety of campaigns, for example, to hold arms companies legally accountable for illegal small arms export, international nuclear disarmament, and advocacy for a revised and restrictive German arms export control law. Last but not least, Ms. Deborah Burton, co-founder of Tipping Point North South, a UK-based nonprofit organization. Deborah has wide-ranging experience across economic justice campaigns, such as trade and tax justice, children's human rights, women's health, and environment. She leads on Tipping Point North South Primary Advocacy Project, Transform Defense for Sustainable Human Safety, which addresses military emissions and spending, climate change and climate finance, UN processes, and wider foreign and defense policy thinking. Previously, her work at Tipping Point North South included executive producing on cinema documentaries, including We Are Many, which explore the global anti-Iraq protest movement, and Open Bethlehem, a film about the impact of the Israeli separation wall on the town and citizens of Bethlehem. The panelists will each offer short reflection, followed by a moderated exchange and audience Q&A. We are so excited and thanks all of our stellar panelists for joining us on this conversation, which brings a wealth of expertise. Over to you, Yvette.
Thank you so much, Lana, for those introductions. And turning to Dr. Nan Tian to kick us off from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So Nan, would you kindly set the scene for us and share current and projected trends in military expenditure in Europe and globally? And in addition, since I understand that CIPRIS contributed to the UN Secretary General's report that I referred to in the beginning, would you share some of your reflections on that report on military expenditure to help us get started? Over to you, Nan.
Thank you, Yvette. Good day, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So to paint the picture, essentially setting the scene, really, we are really in a quite a exceptionally difficult geopolitical and security environment right now, as you mentioned. We're seeing kind of high points in tension, geopolitical competition, disagreements, territorial disputes. We are seeing now more conflicts, but more than ever before. They are now deadlier. They involve the use of large amounts of conventional weapons, and they last longer than ever before. And so, reflecting some of these risks, every year, the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists sets this doomsday clock to midnight to show essentially how close we are as humankind to a global apocalypse. And in 2025, it was set at 89 seconds to midnight, the closest that we've ever been to this catastrophe. In comparison, 10 years ago, this was set at around 3 minutes to midnight. So how things have quickly deteriorated. And so in a way, it becomes quite clear that in light of these developments, countries really are pursuing what is can be seen as a very narrow path of security, where security is really viewed from the lens of military strength and deterrence. And so in terms of numbers, we see that world military spending, as you already had mentioned, which is a reference to kind of the financial resources that states allocate to military security and capability, is at an all-time high of $2.7 trillion. And I think the scale is quite hard to comprehend for people because we're talking in the trillions. And so this a mental exercise I like to always carry out is to consider that if we turn this 2.7 trillion into $100 bills and line it up end to end, there is enough to go from the Earth to the moon there and back 5.5 times. So just get a sense of really how much money is being allocated to military activities. And of course, to reach this 2.7 trillion, the spending in the world has been increasing for the last 10 years in a row. And it's also quite universal in that of the countries that we have data and countries that have the military, about two-thirds, sorry, of all countries increased their spending. And if we group it into regions, all 5 geographical regions saw an increase in military spending. Additionally, 15 of the biggest military spenders in the world, which account for 80% of the world total, so you see quite an imbalance there, all increased its spending in 2024. I think specific to Europe, what we saw is that the 2024 level, of course, following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, was that the level now is beyond higher than the level at the end of the Cold War, pushed up by spending increases by all European countries except for Malta. And so, really looking into, what we've seen now, up to now, and looking into the kind of the short-term future, what we expect is that this trend will likely to continue to increase for the years to come. One, because a lot of countries have already started releasing their 2026 budgets, where we see that they've allocated more money to the military. NATO countries, of course, just agreed to the new guideline of 5% of GDP to defense-related spending by 2035. We saw last week that Trump announced during his address to his generals that the US will be spending more than $1 trillion on the military in 2026. In non-US European kind of military powers, such as China and India, they will also continue to increase their spending as they're also in the middle of very long and expensive military modernization programs. Some of these increases that we see in China has also led to kind of worsening security perceptions by neighboring countries like Japan, Taiwan, Australia, which also is leading to increases. And so it's really not inconceivable to consider that if the global security environment doesn't change very soon, that again by 2030 we could be looking at over $4 trillion to the military, and by 2035, if NATO countries essentially reach their 5% of GDP target, would almost reach more than $6 trillion. And so, not only is there really a shift in the trends of military spending, increasing more and more, there's also a shift in the composition. More money is being allocated to procurement, operations and maintenance, and R&D expenditure. And as a consequence of this, I think what we will see is more investments into the arms industry, both in the manufacturing and R&D capacity. And so also in years to come, kind of more money being allocated to developing, building, and operating a lot of these emerging military weapon systems. And so, I suppose taking a step back and looking into the SG report, it really kind of paints this very challenging picture, right? Where there's clear imbalance between priorities on military spending and what is essentially sustainable development. And the imagery we want to portray is this kind of opening of a scissors effect, where military spending trends are going up, while also, the financing for development also is kind of lacking. And these diverging trends are stark and will become even greater as we go towards 2030. And so, at a general level, the report really poses the question of, well, if countries continue to allocate to the military, will this actually make a country safer? And I think the answer quickly becomes no, it won't. Because firstly, there's the question of a security paradox, where, of course, higher military spending might not lead to security, but actually increase insecurity. But also, of all the numerous kind of security tools that's available, countries continue to pursue military buildup instead of looking into confidence building, risk reduction measures, information sharing, or diplomacy. And of course, additionally, military solutions does not address kind of the underlying factors that lead to insecurity. That security is often this multidimensional outcome, whereas military spending really is one specific input to a very specific outcome. And so instead, resources should be allocated to be invested in, let's say, socio-economic needs, good governance, environmental sustainability that kind of have a direct link towards development, long-term peace, sustainability, and security. And I think the report really kind of highlights some of these channels quite well, where there's opportunity cost of military spending that decreases the rate of GDP growth. It crowds out, social expenditures such as health, education, environment. And of course, there are second order effects that worsen income inequality, gender inequality, and what needs to be considered is kind of the environmental burden of military activities. And so really, I mean, what it kind of puts forward to not only member states, but also civil society and everyone, this report is to say that as we enter into the last 5 years of this Agenda 2030, it's not too late to kind of rebalance this ship. Acknowledging that states will likely continue to increase military spending, there's this call to remind states that there was a universal commitment in 2015 towards sustainable development. So really not forget that and really consider kind of a balanced approach to security spending, such that you increase military spending, but also a human-centered vision of security.
Thanks so much for that, Nan. And you referred to the human-centered approach to security, and I think we all have more or less an intuitive sense of what that looks like. But you started to spell out why this matters. Could you give us some of your thoughts on that? And also, what would that kind of shift require in practice? I mean, I'm asking you to answer the question, but perhaps you can give us some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so thank you. Very briefly, I mean, I think this human-centered approach, it ties to the question of really what should the state be protecting? And I think at the center of that is its people. And then the question, of course, is what increases the security of its people? And then you really think about it, well, it's household income, right? Sanitation, healthcare, education, jobs, environmental security, and also, of course, security of the state or the territory. And so it really becomes clear that it quickly becomes a combination of things and not just, let's say, pure military security that helps kind of address the underlying factors of insecurity. And so in practice, the idea of this human-centered is that there is a balance, that understanding that you need to invest in, let's say, military security, but not forget about the other factors that improve the security of one's people. And so really encouraging a balanced approach of using public resources. Since, it's really public resources that are supposed to be spent on the people, there needs to be some level of course, to make it into practice, transparency, accountability, and democratic oversight in how that money is spent. To ensure that, of course, states are essentially putting money where their mouth is and focusing kind of on the aspects that it should be to provide kind of a multi-dimensional approach to security for its people and not just simply prioritizing one aspect. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nan. Your framing has helped set the empirical baseline that will inform the rest of our discussion. We will now hear from Dr. Leon Castellanos Jankovic, Senior Researcher and Principal Investigator, Rearming Europe with Legal Accountability Rely Project at the Asser Institute. Leon, would you walk us through some of the implication of the European project to increase military spending, including the challenges and opportunities from a legal and regulatory point of view?
Thank you, Lana. Thank you, everyone, for this kind invitation and for joining us for this important discussion. I would like to start the chat with a slide which is showing a cartoon. You can see the slide now, and I want us to just read it and just reflect for a moment. I'll be I'll be quiet for a second while you just process this, and I'll make a few comments. Okay, so we see that Europe is really in uncharted territory. The European Union is walking into an unprecedented space, as Nan has already said. With the CIPRI data that they have published this year, we see the incremental rise in expenditure, but we also see politically, I'm going to zoom into the EU, that this particular institution is in breaking new ground. Right? And things are about to get very interesting in the EU, but unfortunately for the worst of reasons. So with this presentation, I just want to tell you a little bit about what is going on here from where I'm sitting in Europe and what kinds of things the Rearm Europe initiative is doing and what can we expect. And so now we can take down the slide and I'll continue the presentation. Thank you very much. So just to come back to the numbers that Nan was mentioning, and I mentioned this a little bit, in the EU, the Commission has earmarked 800 billion euros to spend on its Rearm Europe Readiness 2030 program between now and 2029. 150 billion euros have already been sort of released and are being directly raised and spent in the EU in order to do this. And this is a humongous amount of money. Now, I want to talk a little bit first about the EU and what it is doing. Then I'll discuss what the member states of the EU are doing and the relationship, right? Because we need to distinguish between the two. And then we can continue a little bit with what this means for third states that are outside of the EU. And first of all, what I can say is that the Rearm Europe initiative is about procurement. It is not necessarily about transfer and sale, right? This is not about arms trade. This is about arms production. This is a huge drive to re-equip, to rearm, and to restock and replenish items and capabilities that, according, right, to the military industrial base experts, have been depleted or are non-existent. And of course, this has begun because of the support that the EU has been providing to Ukraine. The acceleration of rearmament or the impetus for rearmament begins with supporting Ukraine against the illegal aggression of the Russian state. And the progressive initiatives have become more and more complex. But I want to stress this point about the initial response and the support for Ukraine, because those decisions have been made with a crisis rationale, right? And so the risk here is that we continue using this crisis rationale in order to create more permanent legal frameworks for a more sustainable or for a more long-term rearmament policy. Right? So there has to be a distinction between the short-term needs that absolutely need to be fulfilled, right, in order to support Ukraine and prevent Russia from further advancing. But that is a different need, right? The policy that the EU needs to adopt and implement in order to rearm is going to have to be long-term. And so we cannot use that crisis mode. And so here, I think the opportunities for Rearm Europe really come out when it comes to prevention, because when we talk about procurement, we talk about essentially removing bottlenecks, simplifying processes so that other member states can join contracts, cost saving, and interoperability. It has less to do with using systems on the ground, and it also is not necessarily about transfer either. However, we do need to talk about baking safeguards into weapons production and damage prevention, as opposed to dealing with accountability once the damage is done. What do I mean by this? By designing weapons and policies that already take into account human rights and risk assessment safeguards, you can already prevent downstream damage, which is what we'll talk about later on in the presentation. And so what do I see in terms of the main challenges in order to achieve this? Well, I think first there is a risk of deregulating the EU defense market, right? Creating too many sort of shortcuts so that businesses can feel free to skip, important steps when it comes to developing risk assessments and ensuring that their products are not going to be misused down the supply chain or the value chain. In particular, this emergency and crisis response rationale has been sort of copy-pasted into the European Defense Omnibus, and in particular, the proposal for a European defense industry program, which was adopted in March 2024. Now, this is an ongoing legislative process, so I speak out of this, from a position of humility here because the process is changing, the negotiations are ongoing. But in that proposal, it was suggested to single out environmental, health, and safety issues which are directly related to human rights as examples of regulatory areas which could be downsized and for which exemptions could be sought. So if we start giving companies leeway to get these exemptions and to cut down, right, or to roll back protections to the environment, to labor rights, and to human rights when it comes to getting licenses, export permits, and so on, or even production contracts, we're going to be in a worse place in the future, even if the immediate goal is achieved, which is producing at a higher rate and at a higher scale. The proposal also, I think this is another red flag, eliminates or sort of makes end user certificates and retransfer and re-export safeguards optional. This is not sort of set in stone yet, but it's part of the proposal. And I think, again, downsizing on end user certificates, on end user verification, making sure that the intended user is the one who actually received it and is equipped by the arms export, that would be quite dangerous as well. Now, where do I see the opportunities, just to finalize this part of my presentation? I think that Rearm Europe could do a lot to de-risk trafficking and diversion. There's a lot about supply chain traceability, about sort of comprehensive systems and information networks that would allow policymakers, but also perhaps even the public, if transparency, due process are ensured, as mentioned by Nan just now. So that is an opportunity, right? Because if you de-risk trafficking and diversion, if you enhance the traceability, you are able to have even better assessments when it comes to preventing risks. The second point I want to mention as a possible opportunity is the fact that the proposal also creates contractual frameworks which are new and which could be used in order to frame human rights obligations from the get-go, right? So you could include human rights safeguards already at the contractual level before the weapons are made, as opposed to just focusing on the moment of transfer. Because right now, what we do when it comes to preventing downstream damage and human rights violations, we focus on the moment in which the weapon is being sent to a third party, when it is exported, but we never pay attention to the production process. So again, mapping that out would be really, really helpful. And I think we also need to see this as an opportunity, but of course, there are challenges. So I will close this part here and hand back over to you, Lana.
Well, thank you very much, Leon. It's really interesting how you outline the challenges and the opportunities and the what we are going to face in terms of the shortcuts. But would you be able to talk a little bit more on some of this implication of the European project beyond Europe, how that will impact the world?
That's a great question, Lana. Thank you. So the arms industry is not just any kind of industry. It operates on scale, right? So the more you can create scale, the more efficient the production will be. And it's not like these weapons, that they're going to produce just, a handful of them. You need to produce a lot in order to make it sustainable and efficient. that means that the EU is going to be economically pressured by the markets to sell these things outside of the European, right, Union. And so the spillover effect could be quite important, given, again, the fact that 800 billion euros are earmarked for this. And what are the risks of this? If we see European weapons leaving the EU and being used for different purposes, we already have trafficking and diversion and downstream damage with European weapons in Yemen. We see this also in Myanmar. We also see Russian forces using European weapons, but also technology and software in Ukraine against Ukrainian military actors. So, bearing this in mind is very, very important, and taking, again, the opportunity to use the Rearm Europe program and proposals to engage with these problems like very, very directly. I see it as an opportunity, but again, there are risks.
Gosh, thanks so much, Leon, for laying out the European picture and also for really giving your thoughts on the challenges, but also the opportunities when it comes to legal and regulation and accountability. And I think that's really appreciated. And now that we've set sort of these meta analytical frames, we will turn to Professor Cecilia Vallée, who is the UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, and also professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Oslo. And Cecilia, having heard this outline of the current landscape, what are some of the main things you would like to highlight for those, and there are many in the room, who are engaged in building a strong civil society anchored in human rights and solidarity as we're faced with these pressures? What should the priorities for civil society and international bodies be to retain a human rights and solidarity orientation? Over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Well, firstly, I'd like to point out that I think that the setting of GDP targets for defense procurement actually should be considered completely counterproductive, because in spite of the increase in overt and covert armed conflict around the world, it really is arguable that one of the most significant threats to our democracies is AI and cyber-driven misinformation, disinformation, and cognitive warfare that promotes polarization and violence within our societies, and that cannot be countered with military hardware. So notably, it can be argued that the trend towards over-securitization has coupled with the negative repercussions of unequal distribution of wealth, and this has fomented a widespread culture of fear, passivity, and hopelessness within societies, and this has resulted in civic disengagement among many young people. Moreover, in some countries, those who do engage in solidarity for peace expressions or calls for disarmament are increasingly under surveillance. They're being arrested, they're subject to doxing and other forms of silencing. So actually, it's imperative that states support the creation of resilient civil societies in which people feel confident to engage in civic debates addressing human rights, peace, protection of the environment, and procurement versus disarmament issues. So we need a concrete investment in promoting a culture of peace and solidarity through education in order to improve social cohesion and inclusion. So these types of programs I envision would include the promotion of nonviolence as a value, tolerance of differences, mutual respect, empathy, intercultural, interfaith dialogue, badly needed, and gender equality in order to build solidarity between groups within our societies. This is urgently needed in all regions of the world in response to the very real escalation of political violence and division. So another major conceptual problem is that we've seen a shift among policymakers towards conflict management, in which the aim is lowering escalation, but not necessarily aspiring to the restoration of peace. And this thereby leads to the prioritization of defense procurement. So maybe now you could show UN Charter Article 33. When I teach public international law, I'm usually always explaining to the students that international law is characterized by ambiguous drafting. But here, if you look at Article 3, this is a case of actual very clear drafting. And states are given an obligatory sequence that requires them to, first of all, pursue peaceful dispute resolution. And I've never really understood how such clear language in the UN Charter could have been so systematically and persistently ignored by states. And perhaps if this would be respected, the world would look much different now. So you can take it down now. Because of us failing to pay heed to Article 33, conflict has effectively been normalized. Diplomacy institutions, peace assistance, and prevention projects are significantly defunded while defense procurement increases. I actually hear people telling me that we're sleepwalking into the next world war, but sometimes it feels to me like our eyes are actually wide open. Societies that once took pride in ranking high in positive peace, distributional resources such as solid healthcare, support for education, fair labor guarantees, are now pursuing narratives about eliminating supposed waste in these sectors. And they all seem to be reincarnating Sparta as a relevant institutional model. So we have an opaque overhaul of the institutional markers of national identity that are being rapidly conducted without sufficient civic debate. And this is resulting in the diminishment of solidarity programs that are most relevant for women, children, the elderly, minorities, refugees, migrants, and disabled. So the conundrum is that at the same time that many bemoan the regression of democracy around the world, we fail to realize that unchecked militarization actually weakens social cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And following on your intervention, I just want to ask you if you would like to share what you perceive as the most urgent challenges and opportunities when it comes to rising military expenditure.
Well, I think it's the lack of transparency and the lack of clear procedures for civil society to raise solidarity demands, addressing respect for due diligence standards by defense corporations and states. So my next report to the UN Human Rights Council will be on peace and international solidarity, and I welcome inputs by civil society and by states. And I really believe that there's a need for engagement, in particular of women around the world, to strengthen. We need a peace movement directed at preventing global conflict and demanding respect for the obligation of peaceful dispute resolution in the UN Charter in conjunction with upholding the rule of law. So I welcome all civil society groups to register their actions in this solidarity map. It's called Solidarity Actions Around the World, and the link is provided. And this is my effort to enable civil society groups to gain confidence in their ability to network and to engage in defense of human rights and peace and protection of the environment. And I hope it will help change the picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Baye. Your perspective on international solidarity help us move from the research and analysis into the next part of the discussion, what the trades-off in some areas actually are. Let me introduce our next speaker, Ms. Ruth Rod, researcher and project coordinator at Shadow Word Investigation. So, Ruth, would you please unpack some of the opportunity cost, direct and indirect, of so much public spending being diverted to military expenditure?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, including the previous speakers. I fear I will maybe repeat some of the things that have already been said, but I think that just underlines to some extent their importance as I dig into some of the trade-offs of this increase in military expenditure and rearmament a bit more. The first key trade-off I want to talk about is actually in the realm of security. As I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about later, threats to European security are not primarily military in nature, despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Arguably, the largest threat to our collective security in Europe is the climate crisis. Yet, the military is often exempt from calculations and reporting about its undeniable impact on the climate and the environment. And at the same time, as part of this uncritical drive toward militarization, we are, for example, seeing a push by the industry to be listed as a sustainable investment in the EU, essentially taking away the ability from most ordinary people and most ordinary savers and consumers to effectively divest from arms in the interest of environmentally and socially sustainable businesses. At the same time, the militarization of Europe has, over the past number of years, come with an increasing border industrial complex that has significant overlap with the military industrial complex. On the 2nd of September, we actually had the 10th anniversary of a picture that shocked the world of 2-year-old Alan Kurdi, who drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. And according to the International Office of Migration, we actually had almost 33,000 people that have gone missing in the Mediterranean or around it since 2014. Fortress Europe is already a death trap for thousands and tens of thousands of people expanding into the borderlands, for example, in North Africa, where the EU actually pays autocratic regimes like Egypt to keep off people and keep people away from European shores. At the same time, while Europe is massively increasing its arms imports, arms will be flowing outwards as well, as we will be seeing with increasing military production. And I fear that this will actually be especially the case if we have a slowly stabilizing situation, hopefully, with Ukraine leading towards hopefully some sort of, I'm not expecting a just peace just yet, but a more stable situation in Ukraine. We will end up with massive overproduction of military goods in Europe, and this will eventually lead to a major outflow of weapons. And even more unhindered outflow of weapons from Europe will make us less secure in the medium term. And European countries are currently in the business of dissolving arms export control regulations rather than strengthening them in the interest of. Leon actually gave a lot of good examples as to why we should be caring about the blowback from arms exports and the impact not just on ourselves but obviously already on people in Sudan, in Gaza, in Myanmar, and other places around the world. I want to highlight in this context that this is not an avoidable side effect of rearmament. It's kind of a feature of the system. At the same time, and this has already also been mentioned, we are seeing not only a financial but also an ideological and discursive shift away from diplomacy, from peace studies, from confidence building measures, and from development assistance and emergency aid. So while billions are shifted towards the defense industry, individual European countries, as well as the EU as a bloc, are restructuring and cutting development assistance and aid, which on top of President Trump's assault on US aid is hurting the most vulnerable people in the world, as well as, and as cynical as this is, always in the context of aid, it's also undermining the EU soft power. And then finally, something that scares me in how little it is discussed is the fact that we are militarizing Europe at a time when the far right is rising in major European countries. This rise of the far right we know is connected to the rise in inequality that is tearing on our social fabric and our societies. But instead of tackling inequality, we are increasing authority-based modes of being, patriarchal modes of being, through things like mandatory military service, through increased policing and surveillance of our own citizens, through our increasing border industrial complex. Major European countries like Germany, like the UK, could see far-right governments in the next couple of years, and we are arming them too. I think it's already been mentioned, but just to highlight as well, very briefly, the fact that we are in all of this only relying on one ideology to keep us safe, which is military deterrence, which is just not a sustainable way to look at it and do international or domestic politics. I'm running a bit behind on time, but so the second big trade-off is on an economic level, where we are seeing European countries essentially restructuring their entire economies towards military expenditure. On a European level and on a national level, we have a lifting of austerity measures for defense and defense only. The arms industry is currently becoming not an area of public investment, it's becoming to look like the only area of public investment. This means austerity for the people, for health services, for pensions, for investment in the much needed green transition, but sheer endless money for arms makers. We are seeing our economies become, for decades, reliant on an industry that is dependent for all of its money and all of its investments on states wanting more weapons. And those states will inevitably be fighting wars, whether they be domestic or imperial. Time and time again, studies have shown that the arms industry is not a good motor for the economy, as leaders like Keir Starmer in Britain try to claim. In fact, spending on arms and the arms industry produces much fewer jobs than investments in healthcare and education, for example. The question here is not so much one of guns versus butter, but is one of restructuring our entire economy towards submarine production while harvests are devastated by the climate emergency. And finally, and I have a light turning off. I have a few examples of this that I don't think I have time for. We are going to see a major cost to democracy and the rule of law from this rush to arms. And I'm not only speaking of assaults on international humanitarian law. Leon has already spoken to some of the dangers of reductions in so-called red tape, which is in reality essential safeguards on human rights and health. We are seeing countries trying to be reliable partners in weapons making, which essentially leads to a lowest threshold level of regulation when it comes to arms exports. We have countries explicitly ignoring their own arms export control laws for the benefit of international partnerships, such as the UK government is currently doing with the F-35 fighter jet supply chain, which they themselves have assessed could be used to violate international humanitarian law in Gaza, and still we are exporting in contravention of the law. The UK government has created a specific carve-out for this, but this has a precedent. Germany did the same thing with the Eurofighter when it came to its arms embargo in Saudi Arabia. We have these things laid down in treaties like the Treaty of Aachen between Germany and France now. At the same time, this is my last point. We are seeing increasing domestic crackdowns in all of these countries in the name of being against radicalization and foreign interference, with data mining company, mass surveillance, and militarized policing, all justified in the name of security. We have companies like Palantir, which are complicit in some of the crimes that we're talking about, suddenly having unprecedented access to all of our data in Europe. So in summary, sort of European militarization is already in the here and now making people unsafe. It's not a sector that drives sustainable economic development, and in fact, it exacerbates inequality as a major arena where governments sidestep the rule of law. It normalizes violent repression of dissent rather than fixing underlying issues of economic inequality, environmental breakdown, and complicity in international crimes, all the while entrenching in us one singular ideology, Fortress Europe. I think it's imperative that we resist this process while also encouraging positive transformation, excluding, as has been mentioned, not reducing necessary safeguards, promoting a free civil society rather than repression, and while we're at it, how about an emergency fund for peace research?
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, for this. You touch upon this, but if you don't mind, can you elaborate a little bit about how does increased militarization risk undermining transparency, opening space for corruption, shifting power toward elite institutions, and what the impact does this have on democracy?
This is a very big question that could be its own whole presentation, but let me say this much. We know that the arms trade itself is one of the most corrupt businesses in the world. And if I may, I actually disagree with Leon a little bit that this is a matter just that there's a difference between procurement and the arms trade, because arms also get sold within Europe and within Western countries, and this doesn't necessarily mean it's less problematic than arms flowing out. We have, at the same time, governments and officials often deeply complicit in the corruption of the arms industry or turning a blind eye to it. Just a few years ago, European giant Airbus had to pay a fine of $3.9 billion for corruption. But how has this affected in the end their access, for example, to tenders? At the same time, often this money sort of flows back into our political systems. For example, Rheinmetall, one of actually the company that has received, I think, 40% reportedly so far of the 100 billion of Germany's extra sort of military budget. One of their subsidiaries has recently offered German MPs 2,000 euros in campaign contributions, specifically targeting members of the budget and defense committees. This is raising the serious question, is our democracy really this cheap? Is it really so easy to sell out? This At the same time, we're actually not seeing an increase in transparency. Instead, we're seeing a reduction in transparency, especially as more and more of this gets shifted to the EU level, where we already have a major democratic deficit and where we already have a lack of understanding and a lack of media and civil society and general society knowledge and monitoring of how the EU works and how the EU institutions are making decisions. Transparency International likes to talk about corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But we really have to ask here, who even is entrusting all of this power to the CEOs of Rheinmetall, of Lockheed Martin's, your BAE? Nobody voted for these people, and yet they are the ones sitting on the panels that are basically drafting the policies that are then being copied from the EU, which is by the EU, which is why we are thinking of the arms trade as moving dangerously close to a system of state capture, which is basically corruption becoming institutionalized, where an entire political system is built to the benefit of private interests and private profits, where you have undue influence on policy, undue influence on the implementation of policy, and finally the disabling of accountability mechanisms, which we're seeing time and again with the arms industry. And this is having, especially in the context of violent means and tools, a major impact on healthy democracies.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Ruth, for having painted this incredible picture. I mean, it's an alarming picture about some of the costs of excess public spending on rearmament, and highlighting how these trends will weaken the very foundations of accountable governance, but also worsen inequality. I think you said something like austerity for everything else, but endless resources for rearmament. And especially drawing out there towards the end, the impacts on democratic institutions as we know them. Thank you very much. And now turning to round us off to Ms. Deborah Burton, co-founder of Tipping Point North-South. Thank you for being with us. And Deborah, the 2025 report of the UN Secretary General on military spending signals that militarization is crowding out social investment. We've made this point. Could you expand on how this dynamic plays out in relation to the climate crisis and ecological resilience? What does rising military expenditure mean for the climate and environmental crises that we're living through? Over to you, Deb. Deborah, I think you are muted. I'm going to try and unmute you.
You're right, Yvette, I'm muted. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this absolutely brilliant discussion. Thank you so much. And as your webinar description says, the prioritization of military expenditure comes with complex trade-offs, and this includes the profound undermining of our ability to fully address the climate crisis. There is a direct correlation between military spending and military emissions. So the more you spend on your big ticket fossil fuel reliant weaponry, the warships, the jets, the tanks, the bombs, the missiles, the more you emit. And the more spent on militaries, the more the poorest and climate vulnerable are robbed of the resources needed to fund the SDGs and climate finance. I mean, this in a nutshell is what rising military expenditure means for climate and the environmental crises we are living through. I'm going to speak briefly about emissions, military emissions and military spending versus climate finance, and finally a few points on what we need to see happen on these issues. So to emissions, in peacetime and in war, the big spending militaries are significant greenhouse gas emitters. They are estimated to account for approximately 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than shipping and civil aviation combined. It is more than the 54 nations of the African continent. And collectively, it has an annual carbon footprint that will place it fourth largest in the world. That is on a par with Russia. And that 5.5% figure does not include emissions from wars and conflict, nor from post-conflict reconstruction. Since the Kyoto Protocol, where the USA led the way in making sure that reporting military emissions to UN agencies in a full and transparent way was voluntary, largely citing security, we have continued to have, as a result of that, major data gaps. UN FCCC, the UN Framework on Climate Change, Convention on Climate Change, does require reporting of military fuel use. However, national inventory reports may include some military emissions, but full military carbon footprints encompassing supply chains, that's the arms trade that we've been hearing about, international military aviation and maritime transport, and multilateral operations are often excluded from official inventories, leading to a significant emissions gap that underestimates the military's true carbon footprint. So we need comprehensive reporting to the UN FCCC in order that, for example, the all-important IPCC can accurately measure and address the significant greenhouse gas emissions from the military sector. So to this correlation of spending and emissions, and again, we've heard from Nan, the big numbers. Only a few years back, NATO members were being asked to reach for 2% of GDP for military spending. Now, largely as a result of the war in Ukraine, NATO's 32 members are being urged to reach for 3.5% of GDP, and as we've heard from Leon, with a further push for 5%. So in research just published for this last week of Global Action in September, research published by Stuart Parkinson at Scientists for Global Responsibility has estimated that for each $100 billion increase in spending, military carbon footprint rises by around 32 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So 10 years of NATO spending at that 3.5% of GDP level would release a total of 1,320 million tons of CO2 extra over the current 2024 spending level. And there is another terrible truth, as we've heard, to this ever-increasing military spending issue. It does not bring greater security. It has the opposite effect. Between 2010 and 2022, conflicts almost doubled, and 2023 saw the highest number of conflicts since World War II. Conflicts drive 80% of all humanitarian need. And in so many of the wars and conflicts we have witnessed and we are witnessing today, it is civilians, and it is notably women and children who are bearing the brunt of brutal bombardments. So at the very time we need not to be giving up on 1.5 degrees of warming, all of this military buildup on absolutely every level is catastrophic for the climate and for our humanity trying to adapt to climate chaos. So I'm going to say a little bit about climate finance and military spending. Because runaway military spending is robbing Peter to pay Paul. The SDGs need at least 2.4 trillion per annum by 2030. Development aid is being cut in my own country here in the UK and other countries Development aid is being cut in favor of defense, and climate finance is nowhere near the priority it needs to be. At COP29 in Baku, the Climate Action Network, it's a network of just almost 2,000 NGOs around the world, it called for $5 trillion annually for climate finance. That's what it considered an adequate response to what's needed. Instead, the parties agreed on 1.3 trillion per annum, with only 300 billion of that coming from public finance, 300 billion. Meantime, as we've heard, public military spending is soaring, and much of that public money is pouring into the arms industry. So this oft-repeated mantra by rich countries that there is no money absolutely does not wash. Just to put this in perspective, two quick examples. The F-35, the latest all whistles and bells jet, fighter jet, is now selling around the world, which, by the way, the F-35 uses 6,000 litres of jet fuel per flying hour. That F-35 took more than 20 years, I think 25 years to develop at an estimated cost of $2 trillion for that jet. And to give a sense of scale, it's a bit like Nan saying, you know, if you line your dollar bills up, it would go to the moon and back on global military spending. Give a sense of scale of what that 2 trillion would have supported. UN disaster risk reduction for 4,000 years. WHO funding at 2 billion per annum for 1,000 years. Or UN peacekeeping operations at a 4.5 billion per annum level for the next 440 years. And NATO's new military spending target, this 2 to 3.5% of GDP. NATO states already spend 52 times more on the military than on climate finance. And our recent research shows that NATO's new 3.5% GDP target over the next 5 years would deliver total military spending for NATO over 5 years of $13.5 trillion. That is a 2.6 trillion increase above the current level over a 5-year period. That extra 2.6 trillion would cover nearly 3 years' worth of climate finance needs of developing countries at $1 trillion a year. Or it could pay outright for the world's global electricity grid to be upgraded and made net zero compatible by 2030. So to briefly round up, what do we need to happen? On military emissions, we want complete and transparent reporting of military greenhouse gas emissions in national inventory reports to the UN. Military emissions must be included within national targets for the nationally determined contributions. These are plans for cuts to emissions. And that's going to be very, very hard, by the way, for the military because they're totally fossil fuel reliant. And militaries, and we've talked about the arms trade a lot here, and this is critical. Militaries must provide full data on their supply chain, the arms industry, except for Norway, and this is back to Stuart's research, except for Norway, no other military has ever reported scope 3, i.e. supply chain emissions. And it's estimated for the military that scope 3 is 5 times as large as scope 1 and 2 combined. So the supply chain play a huge role in the military emissions story. And on military spending, finally, we need an ever wider take-up of growing civil society calls, especially when inside the UNFCCC spaces, for the redirection of a significant percentage of public military spending to be included in overall climate finance provision, having it join with calls for an end to fossil fuel subsidies, taxes on polluters and profiteers, and debt cancellation. We want military spending in there. And remember that cuts to spending, military spending, is also a big win for the climate because it means significant cuts to emissions. But finally, beyond this, we need a sea change in redefining defence, one that is fit for the 21st century, that places threats such as, and we've heard this from other speakers, the climate emergency, pandemic, and inequality. They need to be on the same footing as the conventional threats we've talked about here and that have been framed over past centuries. The recent report, UN report that Nan spoke to, that describes what we need to rebalance military spending for a sustainable and peaceful future, one that prioritizes diplomacy, cooperation, sustainable development, and disarmament over military build-ups. Thank you. Over to you, Yvette.
Thank you so much for all of that, Deborah. That was very powerful, and I'm struck by you referenced several times the links between military spending, defense, and the fossil fuel sectors. And I wonder if you could help us talk a little bit about the interconnections between the defense industry and the fossil fuel industry, and how these interconnections may amplify climate risk, and then how, what can civil society and other actors do to raise awareness or
Yes.
otherwise intervene?
Oh, well, basically, there's no military and their supply chain, which of course are, as we've heard, totally indivisible. There's none of that without fossil fuel, because fossil fuel is absolutely the lifeblood of the modern military. Peacetime operations, maintaining bases overseas, war fighting, they all depend on fossil fuels, such that now, we refer to the military industrial complex. It's now known as the military fossil fuel complex. So on supply chains, on the arms industry, I mean, the manufacturing of military equipment and infrastructure requires significant use of fossil fuel derived energy and materials such as steel and aluminium. And the other thing, of course, to remember in all of this is oil military spending and conflict are indivisible. I mean, many of the wars, past and present, we're seeing have a direct link to the protection and or securing of a steady supply of fossil fuels. But the really important thing, and Nan painted this picture of the trajectory we're on, and Leon and Ruth, where we're going in terms of rules and regulations being modified, being pared back in order to expand on arms production. Military emissions and military spending are gaining traction within these UNFCCC spaces, without a shadow of a doubt. That is due to Ukraine and very much due to Israel's war on Palestine and Gaza. And likewise, the links between militaries and fossil fuels are becoming ever more included in the wider climate movement, advocacy, and campaigning. So it's a sad thing to say, but this issue has really come to the fore primarily because of present day wars, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's war on and genocide of the Palestinian people. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for drawing those links out for us and making it very clear how the arms industry, the fossil fuel industry, climate change, and all this resource allocation lines up. And I want to thank you, but also the panelists who went before you, for sharing these very rich reflections. It's not going to be possible to attempt to summarize what has been a really wide-ranging and insightful discussion, and except to say that it's true. You've all made it abundantly clear that we need a broader understanding, even a paradigm shift, when it comes to how we think about security collectively. And that notion of security is going to need to include healthy social systems, inclusive, democratic, and actually functioning governance, notions of planetary health and human dignity, and one might even say dignity of other living beings. And this is a complex issue, and I know that in the room with people who've been working on this for some time, and it can, when you see these trends increasing like this, it can start to look a little bit bleak. But one thing that gives me hope is seeing all of the expertise we've got in the room in terms of the panelists. You will represent different spheres of expertise. But I'm also encouraged that such a broad community registered to attend today's discussion. So we've got folks who registered from different fields: disarmament, arms control, peace building, human rights, humanitarian law, climate change, gender equality. And amongst the participants are representatives from governments, international organizations, academia, civil society, and just individual concerned citizens whom I would really like to welcome. And I think coming together in this way, even virtually, allows us to dialogue across disciplines, because this isn't an issue we're going to be able to tackle from one sector or on our own. We really are going to need multiple perspectives so that we can begin to imagine together a more balanced and human-centered approach to security. So with that spirit of collaboration in mind, we'll move to our Q&A to hear from people in the room. And I would invite you to, some of you have already inputted chats into the chat box, and we'll turn to Lana now so that your different expertise can help us prompt our panelists to bring their expertise to bear on some of the questions that you've been asking. And I think I'll turn to Lana now to help guide us through the Q&A section. Lana.
Thank you, Yvette. As you said, the diverse group that attended with us, they are with us today, has really sparked a lot of question. So I will start with the first question for all panelists. To what extent should arms producing corporation be subjected to human rights due diligence obligation under frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, especially when their products are exported to region with ongoing human rights violation? A related question, what role can international law or treaty frameworks play in enforcing accountability on state and corporation? So I will invite any of our panelists to answer this question. Leon, then I will be democratically volunteer Leon to answer this question.
Okay, great, Lana. So there's a couple questions for me in the chat, so maybe I can pass on this one so that others have the opportunity, because I don't want to just hog the space. But I do want to share one thing that speaks to the first question and then hand back to you, which is the amazing ABA's guidance on defense industry, human rights, and due diligence published in 2022. And I've just shared this in the chat. And I know, Lana, that you were involved in this project. So maybe you can also say a couple of sentences and hand back to one of the speakers. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you, Leon, of sharing the ABA guidance. And we come from the position that the defense industry has a responsibility to respect human rights, and they have to uphold their obligations and to be abided and to set up human rights due diligence with end-use monitoring in their part of their operations. And in our guidance, we outline the consequences for not abiding and taking all the necessary due diligence to protect and to respect the human rights. We invite you to go into the details of the program, and what we tried to debunk all the myths that the defense industry put forward, particularly that the diligence is performed by regulator, or they are an exceptional sector, that they are not, their relation is coming with the nexus of state and their operation nexus, the security nexus with the state. So with that, probably I will ask Professor Bayet to answer in terms of what role can international law play in enforcing accountability on states and corporations.
Well, I mean, we had the recent report from Francesca Albanese that really focused on corporations and was so effective that she ended up being sanctioned. So there's that. But you know, in Norway, we have a pension fund, and we had a lot of engagement from people that were in corporations, but also the Red Cross and different actors that were putting pressure on the pension fund to withdraw investment from corporations that were engaged in conflict areas like Palestine. So that actually was remarkably effective, and it was a way of engaging that didn't directly involve the courts, actually. So what I think is interesting is that in the age that we're in, that we can't think only in the box of traditional litigation, that we actually may have to recognize that in the age of mass communication, that sometimes social media campaigns and other things that will affect the conception of the corporation that is concerned with what kind of image it has. And you'll see not just defense companies, but also other companies that are active in areas where you have military conflict will be adopting guidelines. Like Ericsson is a perfect example of a company that has gone so far as to adapt guidelines to ensure that it will not be involved in situations that would be promoting conflict. So I think that we have to be creative in approaches, and in some cases, if we can find domestic courts that would be willing to take a case and not declare it a political question or something like that, then we can go about that. But we should also be willing to go and pursue alternative avenues that are non-legal, but that may be more effective in practice, like social media campaigns.
Thank you very much. I will turn to the question that posed to Lyon. How does the picture you describe about EDIP and EU rearmament program look when considering also the recent revision of the EU common position and the coming revision of the transfer directive? And is this not showing that the issue of facilitating and increasing export outside EU is an intentional element of the EU policy?
Thank you, Lana. Yeah, and thank you, Letizia. So totally, right? Like the EU, for those of us who aren't very familiar with these are instruments that are regulating weapons transfers. So what does the EU need to do, or what do the member states need to do? What kinds of standards and safeguards do they have to implement before they're sending weapons to third parties? And by design, the EU permits this and has this sort of integrated into its legislation. But my point in the presentation was that on top of that, you're going to have market forces that are pressuring industry within the European Union to produce more in order to scale up and to make the process more efficient and to streamline the production. So, and I see that as a risk, because that means that this could fuel more conflict in third states. And we just heard, right, from Deborah and Ruth and others, how the presence of these weapons in armed conflicts and substituting this for which one could use for development funds is increasing the likelihood that violence will erupt in places where it otherwise shouldn't be. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Leo. Oh, oops. No, I am not on a mute because I kept doing this. So since I have you, Leon, there's another question. Given the economic pressure you mentioned, do you think it's plausible that EU could effectively become a major arms manufacturer in the years to come? If so, do you think that this risk can be mitigated through a legal regulatory approach, such as one your project RELY is advancing?
Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Nicolo. So I just want to clarify. So the EU is not aiming to become an arms manufacturer, right? The European Union as an institution, as a supranational entity, is not making these weapons. It is creating rules and processes so that the states members of the EU can coordinate better in the production, right? And here you run into a problem really quickly, because even though the EU is adopting uniform policies for the most part, each member state has the sovereignty, right, to decide upon its own national security and defense. So each state is running at different speeds. And so when you have an airplane with 5 engines and one of the engines is going, on a high-speed regime and the other engine is on idle and the third engine is on climb, right? It's going to be very difficult to control that plane. So I don't think the EU sort of as a unit is going to be a major player. But if we look at individual states, France, for example, is right now the #2 producer, as we've seen in the CPRI data, and exporter as well, bypassing Russia last year, I think it was. The EU also is very weak on AI. I think we haven't talked a lot about technology. So compared to the US, compared to China even, EU only last week announced the launch of its Tilde Open LLM made in Latvia. So I've just shared the sort of announcement that the European Commission made of this. And so, household names like Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, these are the, most lethal, the biggest purveyors of lethality right now, probably because of their abilities to target. And I think we have to talk more about them. And I hope that this can be part of the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. We have a question to all speakers. So I invite you to unmute and answer as you see fit. So the question, how much access to critical raw material is part of the picture from the general picture set by the EU Defense White Paper, as well as Devil's Detail in specific program about prioritizing the armament sector of a civil society. The impression is that the EU is more preparing for military secure access to raw material over the world in the same vein as we saw oil wars. Are there other elements also outside Europe confirming this impression? So probably we'll start with Deborah.
Sorry. Critical minerals it's interesting. There was a report just published, which I would recommend people look at by Global Justice Now on critical minerals. And it's extremely useful in the way that it really breaks down the degree to which critical minerals are really critical. But also the importance of certain critical minerals absolutely to the military supply chain. So I would say if you wanted to find out more about some real detail in terms of how the search for critical minerals is driven by the needs of the military, I would go to that Global Justice Now report. I'll try and find a link in the to put in the chat.
Oh, we've done it.
Sorry, thank you very much. I see Ruth is typing the an answer. Any other panelists would like to add?
I just put it in the chat rather than in the Q&A box. It's just the link to the Global Justice Now report, which focuses on the UK, but is very useful in terms of showing how critical minerals are even classed as critical, and how the military industry, how we can see specifically on the example of the UK, how some minerals that are classed as critical are actually either only critical or primarily critical for the military industry. So you have here almost a cycle or a self-fulfilling prophecy where minerals are classed as critical because they're needed for the military industry, but then we need the military industry to have access to those minerals.
Thank you very much. But I have a question for you, Ruth, been put in the chat since I have you. Would you have some academic or other sources to share to support the statement that the climate is a much bigger security challenge for Europe than Russia military threat that we could be referring to in the advocacy work?
Yeah, so I think maybe I should specify the term bigger. What I mean by bigger in this context is more immediate. Obviously, if Russia were to set off a nuclear bomb in Berlin, that would be a bigger security challenge than even the climate crisis. However, it's actually a great question because it gives me the opportunity to say that I mean, there is risk reports. I think the EEA published last year a report on the climate risks in Europe. However, we must also be careful not to adopt a securitizing, militarizing lens towards dealing with the climate crisis. And for that, there is research that has been done by, for example, Nico Edwards. But also, I think the Transnational Institute has put out a climate primer that talks specifically about how we can resist the militarization of talking about the climate emergency. And so I think this point is less to, this doesn't mean, by the way, that I don't think we should take Russia seriously and look at its actions. It's more about right-sizing the threat and getting out of this emergency mindset, or maybe into an emergency mindset with some other major challenges that we're dealing with, like the climate emergency.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Let me end with two questions, but with the first one to Nan. What actors, sectors are missing from the conversation about rising militarism, and who is not represented in these debates based on your wealth of research that should be, and how we can engage them? And also the question to all speakers, if you have any advice, suggestions for campaigners trying to convince financial services company. Professor Bayi already mentioned pensions fund that they need to do more to prevent the transfer of weapons to parties known to be committing war crimes and grave abuses of human rights. So let me start with you, Nan.
Thank you. I think, briefly, I think public perception is incredibly important right now. We see that, after 2022, there was this huge, support for, let's say, Sweden, Finland joining NATO and supporting kind of a more kind of militarized sense of security. But I think that quickly, changes as we look at more in terms of the long term, security perspectives. And so I think getting kind of more the public involved in advocating for, this idea of, let's say, a human-centered approach to security, it's, we speak within a room of people that really agree with us, but trying to get the public to put pressure on, let's say, parliamentarians then to the states themselves to really consider how the resources being allocated. And I think and maybe thinking about one way forward about this is that there is evidence historically and within research that when conflict ends with, let's say, with a good peace agreement, military spending falls not only for the countries involved, but also neighboring countries. And that kind of decreases the sense of, geopolitical tension or security and opens up room where resources can be allocated to other developmental purposes. So thinking about, the long-term solutions is really how can we really solve the current, let's say, the conflicts that is going on right now, and how that can open up resources for developmental expenditure.
Thank you very much, Nan. Any of the speakers would like to provide any suggestion for campaigners?
Yes, just very briefly. I think there's two things. First of all, we need to really tackle this EU exemption from or like inclusion in the ESG criteria, the sustainable investment criteria of the arms industry. This is a policy challenge, and unfortunately, that's not a campaign recommendation. But if we can't keep the arms industry out of the ESG criteria, this will make it impossible, virtually impossible, for ordinary people to divest their own money from these industries. In cases like where you're targeting specific funds that actually manage their own portfolios of investments, like the Norwegian pension fund, like other pension funds, there it can be helpful to target specific things that are already in their policies. So, for example, the Norwegian Pension Fund already has policies around anti-corruption, the use of weapons of mass destruction, and we have done this in the past. You can advocate on the basis of those existing policies and show how companies are doing the things that are already excluded from funds. And in the UK, we're currently seeing a major push focusing on a specific war or a specific conflict, or in this case, a specific genocide, which is the genocide in Palestine, to really lobby councils and other pension fund providers, for example, from divesting from arms companies that are complicit in this particular genocide.
Well, thank you very much. I know the discussion is very lively, and we are already over time, and we don't want to take much of everyone's time. So I will turn for quick final thoughts, really less than 1 minute. I will start with you, Nan, and we'll go into the order of speaking. So over to you, Nan, for quick final thoughts.
I think just final thoughts in terms of take kind of the initiative that's been put out by the ESRI report to really, galvanize this debate regarding the uses, of course, the consequences of military spending, how it's being spent, and how we should refocus our priorities on the sustainable development for kind of long-term peace and security. Thank you.
Leon?
I would just like to express my gratitude to the organizers for convening this fantastic panel. I thought we had an amazing discussion. I'm taking a lot home. I also hope that we can sit down also with people with whom we don't necessarily agree and have those difficult discussions. Conflict is necessary to get over impasses, and we should see that in a positive light as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bayet.
Peace has to be built. So it doesn't come dropping out of the air. It actually requires engagement initiatives by civil society, by state actors, by corporations. If we want a peaceful world and if we want to implement the UN Charter, then we have to take the steps to demand and to follow the obligatory sequence of peaceful dispute resolution as the primary duty of the state. And we can't just skip and assume that the use of violence is something that is acceptable. I hope that we will all engage to correct the direction that we've been going in, because it will only lead to violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ruth, over to you.
Yeah, all I'd like to say is in these times, it's really easy to feel hopeless, and it's really easy to feel overwhelmed by the multitude of new challenges, and overwhelmed by the budgets, the sheer money that is being spent out of our tax dollars and euros and pounds into arms lobbying and other things by confronted with a very small civil society. But I think thank you to everybody here, also the people in the participants, because I know that many of you are doing that work every day. And so, yeah, I think we just keep going.
Thanks so much. Over to you, Deborah, to close us on this segment.
Well, I just want to echo what Leon said, actually. Thank you so much for organizing this. And also something he said there about sitting down to talk with people we don't necessarily agree with. There was a very interesting survey done in the US very recently, and it was putting the same question, but with 3 different framings to people. And it was about, do you want to increase spending? Do you want to give more money to the military, to your military? Yes. Would you like to give more money to the Pentagon? Not so sure. And I just think that this discussion here has confirmed for me what we felt for quite some time at Tipping Point, which is that the arms trade is a really solid entry point into making the public, and very often we are propagandized into these foreign and defense policy decision making, and which is reflected in military spending. I think the arms industry and the immorality of the arms industry and the pig trough nature of the arms industry, their noses are well embedded in public taxpayers' money. I think it's an entry point, a way in. So I want to thank everybody here who spoke to that, because I've learned a lot here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thanks to all panelists for the rich discussion. I will turn it to Yvette to close us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lana, for skillfully moderating all these questions and Q&A session. And thank you to everyone who's still here. Thank you to our panelists for staying over time. I will be very quick and close. I just wanted to put up a quick slide. This is on page 30 of the UN Secretary General's report, and it just shows this report is full of wonderful infographics, and it shows where our money is going. It's going to, instead of going to all of these myriad of other places. So I encourage you to take a look at this page. It's figure 11 on page 30 of The Security We Need, and let it galvanize your action. And Daniela, you can take it off again now. Thank you for putting it up. So with that, I just want to thank all of our speakers for coming and sharing their thoughts, their time with us. These are urgent questions. We need to decide together how we want our public spending to be allocated. And I know that this isn't a new topic, and many of you are in organizations that have long called for reductions in military spending, and you have often, like many of us, including the Quakers, been branded as naive or idealist or utopic. But rebalancing global priorities isn't idealism, it's an imperative, or we won't survive. Our civilization depends on us getting this rebalancing right. And I can say that together with the other organizers, we put this panel together out of a deep concern in the hopes that it can contribute. So this is a little contribution to what must be a wider effort to rethink and rebalance global spending priorities. We've covered a lot of ground. There's so much still to cover. So my big hope is that this panel discussion will spark further reflection, dialogue, and collaboration. I hope it has helped to spread the Secretary General's report and some of that fantastic analysis a little bit further. I hope those will come out in classrooms, in universities, in policy forums, civil society networks, and maybe around dinner tables. And those are the little ripples of change that will ultimately shape the tide. So in that spirit, please stay in touch. If you've been struck by an idea or a question, or you have a suggestion or an idea for collaboration and about a way to continue this conversation in a different setting, smaller groups, please get in touch with us, any of the co-organizers, and we'll be happy. But I will put my email in the chat box so that you can, if I find the chat box, here we go. Please get in touch with us so we can keep talking. We will make the recording and the transcript available soon and encourage you to share those widely so that today's conversation and our wonderful panelists can reach more eyes and ears. And just a final note of thanks on behalf of all the organizers and all the panelists. Thank you for those who stayed until the end today, for everyone who joined before, and we hope today's conversation informs and inspires your work ahead. Thank you so much. Wish you a wonderful remainder of the day or your evening, depending on where you are, and take good care. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.